Video games, when compared to other artistic mediums like books or films, are a relatively nascent art form. While the potential for originality has been explored far more exhaustively in those more established mediums, the potential found in video games is relatively unexplored, with the indie space in particular testing new ideas that aren't seen as safe investments by publishers. Among the many other ways you might categorize media, this has led to the discovery of entirely new genres that provide unique experiences, though many of them remain relatively niche. Of these more niche genres in video games that indie developers have embraced, there's one that stands above the rest in my eyes for creating some of the greatest games both in recent memory and across the entire history of the medium, which is the mystery genre. The idea of a mystery genre is nothing new when it comes to storytelling in general, but the implementation of interactivity into a mystery narrative is what makes many mystery games like Outer Wilds and Return of the Obra Dinn so exceptional, but also so challenging to get just right from a game design perspective. This genre, and the various challenges that designers face when simulating the experience of solving a mystery, are what I'd like to talk about today. So let's get into that. Before getting into any deeper design discussion, I do need to make clear what specific sort of mystery game I'm talking about, because there are a number of different ways you could define this genre. First of all, mystery games are obviously a type of puzzle game. They typically focus on testing the deductive reasoning of players and their ability to draw accurate conclusions from what information the narrative provides. This puts them in contrast with more traditional, mechanically focused puzzlers that focus on giving the player a set of strict, clearly defined rules that govern what solutions are viable. For instance, the Portal game's Portal Gun is a very powerful tool for navigating the game's environments, but very specific, clear, and consistent restrictions are applied, like restricting portal placement on certain surfaces and disallowing the placement of portals through existing portals. Instead of being driven by their mechanics and challenging the player to understand what is and isn't possible within the game's strict bounds, the puzzles found in mystery games are driven by their narratives, instead challenging the player to understand what is and isn't true within the game's story. The specific sort of puzzle game that mystery games are most similar to is the adventure game. Adventure games also have puzzles that are driven by narrative more so than mechanics, though there is usually a minor mechanical challenge offered. Puzzles in adventure games typically involve exploration and the use of various items in combination with each other. Devoid of any narrative context, it's essentially arbitrary what the items in these games will do, but the additional context provided by the story is oftentimes critically important when it comes to how intuitively the player can solve the puzzle. For instance, the first overarching puzzle in One Shot asks the player to reactivate a power source inside this building. Once you repair the battery that powers the generator, it needs to be charged with solar energy according to an instruction manual. Mechanically, this puzzle is a simple matter of combining the correct items, which are the battery and the light bulb, but it's made far more interesting by the game's story, as the light bulb used to charge the battery is the sun in the game's world. The player is challenged to make the connection between the light bulb's nature and the method used to charge the battery as laid out in written materials found in the game world, which points the player towards which items need to be combined. While this puzzle is mechanically mundane, the way it ties into the game's story and forces the player to consider their information carefully is what makes it interesting. One Shot and other adventure games like it aren't necessarily mystery games, however, so there needs to be some distinction separating them. While I don't want to define a strict line in the sand between these two genres, I can propose a more soft definition that forms around how the game blocks player progress. To me, the defining trait of the mystery game is a primary, game-wide focus on testing the player's comprehension of story elements as its main source of challenge. For instance, Return of the Obra Dinn technically blocks the player from leaving the boat and finishing the game until they've entered every available memory, but the bulk of a blind playthrough is spent piecing together the fates of each crew member based on the brief, interconnected stories told in each of those memories. Finding the memories themselves is, by comparison, extremely simple, as the game instead primarily focuses on what conclusions you can draw once you've collected all the evidence. While adventure games will usually strictly require that you find specific items and specific places to use those items alongside these story comprehension checks, mystery games are defined by their near sole focus on testing the player's understanding of the story. There are some edge cases to be found here, like Chants of Sennaar, which definitely puts a spotlight on comprehension testing through its language translation puzzles, while also mixing in traditional adventure game item hunting, but this definition is just solid enough for my purposes. I'd also like to quickly note that games of any genre can contain stories that primarily revolve around mysteries, but as stated before, I'm focusing on games that actively involve the player in that mystery by testing their ability to follow the story. Games like Firewatch have stories that revolve around a core mystery, but their gameplay isn't about solving that mystery through puzzles in the same way that mystery games like Outer Wilds focus on that specific experience. These games usually reveal their mysterious elements through non-interactive means as a reward for player progress, rather than player progress being hinged on the player's active role in solving the mystery. This is an entirely valid way of handling mystery stories in video games when handled well, it's just not the sort of experience I'm discussing here. With all the definitions out of the way, some of the strengths of mystery games should be clear just based on what sort of puzzles they focus on. While the story in many games can feel like background noise or filler when compared to gameplay sections, mystery games specifically require the player to pay close attention to the overarching story and potentially very small details in that story in order to progress the game. This sort of challenge is core to the appeal of the mystery game, and it's similar to the appeal of mystery narratives in general, which is the ability for the audience to attempt to step ahead of the story by considering all of the evidence given up to that point. Engaging with the story in this way by building your own theories based on incomplete evidence is powerful in non-interactive mediums, but the addition of interactivity strictly forces this engagement by blocking progress behind it. While reading about or watching an investigator in a book or film can make the audience feel like they're simply riding the coattails of a masterful detective, mystery games are all about making you feel like that masterful detective. This also makes mystery games particularly immersive experiences in a way that more mechanically focused games aren't. In most games where the player is in control of a character within the game's world, there is a fundamental disconnect between the player making inputs on their controller and the character's actions in the game. Action games often map their characters' complex athletic feats to single buttons that the player presses, which is essentially a translation that the game performs from input to in-game result, though it's one that can make the player feel more disconnected to those in-game events. Most games will accept this sacrifice because the loss of immersion is minimal compared to how much more interesting the gameplay can be, but while the actions performed in-game may not feel like they're entirely your own as the player, what does squarely belong to the player is their own thoughts and decision-making processes. This is what makes mystery games so immersive, as the player's own deductive process is the main thrust behind making progress in the game. In some mystery games like The Root Trees Are Dead, much of the player's time is spent simply rereading evidence they've already collected and attempting to infer further information based on it, which is a gameplay-relevant activity that requires no translation on the game's part. Essentially, when it comes to making the player truly embody their role in the game's story, mystery games have a leg up over much of their competition because their narrative-driven puzzles often involve more thinking and passively observing than acting, which are activities that aren't as easily lost in that video gamey translation. The focus on allowing the player to play the role of investigator also allows mystery games the opportunity to play around with unorthodox storytelling in a way that feels justified by their puzzles. It's common in traditionally told mystery narratives for events to be revealed in a somewhat non-linear way, sometimes through revealing entirely new pieces of evidence, and other times by putting existing threads into a new context. But the dynamic of the audience following along with an investigation usually preserves some semblance of a traditional structure. By allowing the player agency over how they conduct their investigation, mystery games have much less control over how that investigation plays out, as what leads the player decides to follow and in what order they follow them will be essentially random from player to player. This non-linear storytelling can make up for a relatively simple overarching narrative in some games, with the way in which the player uncovers the plot in a self-directed way driving engagement regardless of what the story ends up being. For instance, Return of the Obra Dinn has a story that would feel quite boring and cliched if it was told in a traditional manner, but the way that plot points are slowly leaked to the player through the memories allows the process of discovering the real story to overshadow the somewhat underwhelming conclusion. Mystery games have the potential to create very powerful experiences by leveraging interactivity to place the player in the role of investigator, connecting the player directly to the story in a way that games in other genres simply can't. However, this doesn't mean that this is an easy result to achieve as a designer. For one, more than most other genres, mystery games will test the designer's ability to write consistent, airtight narratives. Since these games often involve the player piecing together the story themselves based on limited information, any conflicts between different pieces of information can cause a lot of confusion. If the player is able to come to a reasonable, rational conclusion based on complete evidence that conflicts with the conclusion the game wants them to come to at that point, that's a failing on the part of the game's design. Additionally, even if it's not a 100% rational conclusion that may be based on incomplete evidence, the information given by the game can still be confusing, which leads to the same effect even if it's not entirely the game's fault. Return of the Obra Dinn has a clear example of this effect in this memory, where the ship's bosun refers to his Frenchman, and the others in the room tell him that his mate was torn apart. There's only one memory of a person being torn apart in the relevant time frame, which is a man whose appearance is clearly not that of a French seaman in the early 1800s, but many players make this connection and conclude this must be the bosun's mate regardless. The real bosun's mate is actually one of the disappearances in this time frame, but the wording used in the later memory is strong enough evidence for most players that they find this reasoning to be perfectly sound. The conflicting evidence in this case makes this moment an uncharacteristically confusing sore thumb in a game full of otherwise very well thought out, satisfying logical pathways. While that challenge is more so one of writing that will affect a mystery game's design much more than other, less story-driven genres, the primary challenge of pure game design for the mystery game is how the game handles validating the player's conclusions. Ideally, a mystery game will be able to test with a high degree of certainty whether or not the player actually came to the correct conclusions, as allowing the player to continue the game with incorrect assumptions will lead to lots of frustration later on. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to this question, as the context of the game's moment-to-moment gameplay and its overarching story will greatly affect which solutions will naturally fit in that context. The unfamiliar rules and science fiction concepts found in Outer Wilds allow the player's conclusions to be checked in a purely mechanical way that's similar to traditional puzzle games, though the mystery aspect is upheld since the player needs to seek out story content across the game's solar system in order to understand the rules. For instance, the rules of how the player can interact with quantum objects are very unintuitive for the vast majority of players, and the very narrow range of ways they can be interacted with makes blind experimentation a fruitless endeavor. Only after discovering various quantum shards across the planets and reading the notes left behind about their nature can the player hope to have the proper knowledge to solve the greater mysteries surrounding the quantum phenomena. Another solution for validation is fairly niche but also very strong within the right context, which is exemplified by Hypnospace Outlaw. This game takes place on a virtual desktop where you're tasked with investigating criminal activity on a very convincing fake internet, which allows for validation to essentially be handled through an unorthodox method of exploration. The criminal material is usually found on obscure, unindexed pages that require an understanding of the search engine and the knowledge of what to search for in order to discover them. Several puzzles ask for passwords, which is a form of verification that makes complete sense in the context of the sort of technology that Hypnospace Outlaw is all about, and it's additionally an ideal form of verification when it comes to making sure the player is 100% correct in their conclusions. Other puzzles require ingenuity in how the player interacts with the fake operating system, demanding more specialized knowledge that can be found through exploring the information available on the internet. It's a mix of the more specific mechanical actions that Outer Wilds focuses on, as well as actions that take an extremely wide range of inputs through the use of strict passwords, which only work together because of the game's unique setting. But some games require that wider range of inputs while not benefiting from Hypnospace Outlaw's technological focus, which is where the last and arguably most common validation method comes in. I'm going to be calling this method set validation, which should be a familiar concept if you've played mystery games like Return of the Obra Dinn or The Root Trees Are Dead. These two games are about identifying people and specific information about them, whether it be the crew of a ship or an entire family tree spanning multiple generations. Rather than working off manually inputting this information, these games provide the player with lists of names and other traits that can be slotted into specific slots, and only when every slot is correctly filled in does the game consider the mystery solved. However, it would be unreasonable for the game to check for completeness only once every slot is filled, as the player wouldn't receive the necessary feedback to be sure that their conclusions along the way were correct. These slots could be validated and confirmed by the game when the player fills them incorrectly, though this would result in trial and error through testing every combination of inputs being a viable way to completely sidestep the game's challenges. So instead, set validation refers to how these games only confirm their slots when a certain number of slots are correctly filled in at the same time. Set validation does not completely prevent trial and error from being viable practice, though it does a decent job at curbing the practice in most situations. The sheer number of combinations of names and attributes available to the player forces them to engage with the story most of the time, since using trial and error to guess a full set would take a stupidly long time, but a player who is dedicated to avoiding as much of the challenge as possible still has opportunities to use trial and error if they're sure they only have one more slot left to fill. Return of the Obra Dinn in particular provides deduction ratings that indicate how difficult it is to identify each person, which can be used in conjunction with the set verification system to cheat the more difficult puzzles by honestly identifying 2 easy characters and then checking every possible name for a third, more difficult character. While this system is put in place as a form of reassurance for the honest player that they are following the intended line of logic correctly, it can be misused to selectively avoid following that line of logic as well. Considering that the goal of these verification systems should be to ensure that players must engage with the story and associated challenge, set validation is very flawed in this respect. The effectiveness of trial and error can be reduced by requiring the player to input more information for each slot, which has the potential to introduce more doubt into the player's legitimate investigations that lack a smoking gun. Compared to Return of the Obra Dinn, The Root Trees Are Dead requires inputting more identifying information to verify a slot, as the position on the family tree, their occupation, and the person's photo are also relevant, rather than just the name and the cause of death being required in Obra Dinn's puzzles. This naturally leads to trial and error being somewhat more difficult to exploit, since the chances of the player legitimately misidentifying any given person or inputting incorrect information about them is higher, which set verification makes necessary even if the player is abusing trial and error as much as possible. The opposite of this effect can be found in Chants of Sennar's language translation puzzles. In this game, each double page in the journal has a set number of slots that a relatively small number of glyphs can be slotted into, and that page will be verified when the player fills in the slots correctly. Rather than having multiple pieces of information in each slot that help to exponentially increase the number of possible combinations, the relatively small number of combinations possible on each journal page in Chants of Sennar makes trial and error both very easy and very enticing for new players, especially if you run into certain glyphs that feel much harder to translate legitimately. Set verification unfortunately also has an impact on immersion, as the way that sets are verified usually isn't contextualized narratively at all. Although it's a bit more forgivable in Return of the Obra Dinn, since there are clearly somewhat supernatural elements in play in that story, Chants of Sennar and The Root Trees Are Dead definitely don't benefit from this. The verification given after completing a set essentially comes from an omnipotent entity that is never acknowledged by the game in any way, which simply feels very video gamey and does detract from the player's role as a lone investigator, since the game needs to insert itself into the investigation to ensure the player keeps a good pace. Ultimately, using set verification is a compromise that's a necessary evil for many mystery games, as not introducing it will simply make the game far too easy or extremely tedious to complete for most players. Most mystery games include some sort of unrealistic guidance akin to this in some way. It's just a matter of balancing how explicit that guidance is with how difficult it would be to arrive at the correct conclusions absent any guidance from the game. For instance, the ship log in Outer Wilds is contextualized as the player character automatically taking notes on what they discover out in the world, which is a much more natural form of guidance given by the game that doesn't feel so video gamey, though it does have the potential to more explicitly state information and provide connections between leads that the player may have missed on a first pass. While it does feel like a hint system to some extent, its contextualization in the story makes it much more palatable than the much more heavy-handed guidance that set verification provides. But again, in the context of many mystery stories, set verification is probably the best option available to maintain decent pacing. The last thing I'd like to talk about isn't so much a design challenge as it is an unavoidable result of the narratively driven puzzles found in mystery games. When people discuss mystery games online, it's often repeated that you can only play this game once, which is true in a very real sense. The mystery games focus on puzzles that heavily involve the scripted, static narrative, make for puzzles that are similarly static, which isn't necessarily any different than any other puzzle game, but there are two aspects of narrative puzzles that make them even less interesting to replay than a mechanically focused puzzle. First, mechanical puzzles often involve some sort of challenge in execution that can give way to self-imposed challenges like speedrunning, whereas many mystery games only go as mechanically far as selecting names or traits from a list. This doesn't apply to every mystery game, as some do give attention to movement mechanics like Outer Wilds, though these are typically exceptions to the rule with mechanics that take a backseat to the narrative puzzles. However, what is far more detrimental to replayability is how memorable narrative puzzles are compared to mechanical puzzles. The result of a well-presented narrative where players are incentivized to pay close attention to small details is a high degree of memorability, but if you remember the solutions to the puzzles, there isn't too much of a point in playing the game again. Remember that mystery games aim to do little to block the player's progress outside of knowledge checks, so the player is usually able to circumvent any and all challenge the game provides on repeated playthroughs, and depending on the game's structure, they may be able to finish the game in a matter of minutes with that knowledge. It's easy to view this lack of replayability as a flaw, but that sacrifice is made in pursuit of incredible, very unique experiences when played blind for the first time. I first played Outer Wilds over 5 years ago now, but there are still parts of that first playthrough that I remember so fondly because of how well laid out the game's mysteries are and how exciting each major discovery is. It's an experience that can't be captured outside of these very intricate, lovingly crafted worlds and the stories that take place within them, and I think that's more than enough to justify sacrificing replayability. Of course, that is my bias talking to some extent, since I value replayability much less than how well a game executes the blind playthrough, but I'm confident that most people can find plenty of enjoyment in the best games of this genre like Outer Wilds or Return of the Obra Dinn. Although it's still relatively niche, the mystery genre has grown to be one of my favorites over the past several years, and I'm very excited to see where developers are able to take it next.